Mark Thompson here. Thank you for listening today. Welcome to Innovate with Ease, Episode 2, The Motor of Innovation, Part 1. Innovation involves creating. Creating involves willful intent of designers. Willful intent involves cognition, imagination, and decision. Imagination and cognition involve our physical senses, cognitive sensations, memories, visualizations, logic, associations, categorizations, impressions, emotions, calculations, and a host of other things. And all of these involve our minds. Encountering creations that someone else once created also involves our physical senses and our minds. Sometimes sensing those encounters are translated through devices such as lenses, monitors, film, paper, gauges, speakers, or instruments. All of those gathered senses compile into our minds, and our minds process those senses and build cognitive, abstract sensations and impressions, allowing us to react or not react to those creations that we encounter. Our role as designers, engineers, or creatives is to produce creations that not only serve functions, but also capture attention, influence impressions, and produce reactions onto those who encounter our creations. We are to build stimuli that people will encounter, acknowledge, hopefully participate, and maybe even use our creations. And all of this happens within people's minds. Once encounter-pulling features draw observers in, the functions of our creations can begin. And once creations are acknowledged or used, more mind activity takes place. If someone wears a new fashion piece, they may feel beautiful or handsome. If someone drives a new car, they may feel empowered or excited or daring or cool. If someone prepares a new meal, their guests may feel satiated or welcomed or adventurous. Or if a studio produces a rated-R thriller film, their audiences may feel revolted, frightened, uneasy, or wary. All of these reactions can be purposefully planned before the creations are designed. The mind is key for both aspects of creations, the encountering of creations and the development of the creations. Great innovation targets mental sensations carried by the creation's features and functions. If an innovative product functions and works very well, if it solves problems very well, if it overcomes challenges very well, if it satisfies desires very well, if it provides opportunities very well, it produces very cognitive senses and sensations for the observers or users. These sensations produce great impressions, great reactions, and satisfactory emotions. All of these occur within the users or observers' minds. So, for designers, it makes sense to purposefully and strategically target sensations that we want people to experience with encountering and using our creations. Planning sensations and planning creation features to arouse those target sensations involves very focused ideations, all produced within our own designer imaginations. I know there's a lot of shuns, and future shows will cover how to do all of that. But all of these occur within the designer's mind. And so everything centers around the mind. To set the foundation for learning to create with excellence and innovate with ease, we must first explore the mind. To understand the mind, we must first understand the brain. The brain sees what it sees, and it reacts the way it's wired to react. We need to understand the basics of this wiring at a minimum. Once we have a good understanding of the brain, we can form a good understanding of the mind, preparing us for those next steps, the steps of innovation. Now, I told you in our introductory show that we'll make innovating with ease simple and straightforward. Well, unfortunately, the rest of today's show may get a little complex, and that's simply because we're complex. But I'll keep everything straightforward for you and connect all the points and give you some useful takeaways. This is giving us a foundation to do all the work that is yet to come. Now, you might be thinking, why do I, as an engineer, designer, or student, need to bother with neuroscience? You'll see why. It'll become extremely useful and critical. This will be a 2-show series, so let's go to the beginning. And before we get into it, please slide over and tap or click the like button for this video, and please subscribe to the channel to get the entire series of shows to come. Clicking that notification bell will let you know that another show is ready to play. Inside of our craniums, behind our eyes, between our ears, is perhaps the most mysterious object ever known to humankind. And because of this object, humankind itself exists. Today, we're going to contemplate the very device that contemplates. And this contemplation takes place among living cells. Cells that are, practically speaking, just simple little tiny protein and lipid bags filled with what is essentially seawater, and other materials. Materials that enable these tiny bags to live and thrive. Materials that energize and pass energy to others. These little bags are cells. The multiplicity of those little interconnected cells are our brains. Those little energetic cells are called neurons. Human brains are comprised of tens of billions of neurons and tens of trillions of interconnections amongst those many neurons. And there are more neurons than just inside the brain. Neurons extend throughout the extent of the entire body. The brains and nerves of the body are essentially a single entity, a nervous system. The center of life, the center of self, the center of thoughts occurs within our brain. Our heart, our lungs, our gut, limbs, muscles, all serve to sustain the brain and the rest of the body, which also serves the brain. The brain is the central governor and the command center of our entire system, and nearly everything is connected to it. Its connections are nerves made of neurons. So what are neurons? Like any animal cell, a neuron has a central body that includes a nucleus and cytoplasm with many parts that keep the cell alive, energized, and functioning. The central body is called a soma. One aspect of a neuron that makes it different from any other cell is its multiple branched-out, thin, fiber-like extensions, much like the branches and roots of a tree. Many branches extend out locally from the soma. These local branches are called dendrites. And one very long fiber extends out from the soma, extended to far-reaching distances. This long branch is called an axon, and it is surrounded by other cells and a sheath material protecting and optimizing the axon's function. Many axons are about 1 millimeter in length, which is quite long for any cell. But some axons extend greater than 1 meter as they reach far across the body, enormously extreme lengths for single cells. And at the far end of the axon, at its terminal bulb, there are many other branches called telodendria. The ends of each branch reach out to the ends of dendrites of other neurons, or to muscles, glands, organs, or sensory regions. A neuron passes charge across its length and exchanges charged chemicals to its neighbors, causing action potentials, which trigger other cellular or body activity. And the fascinating magic is that when one neuron engages with a neighboring neuron, or when multiple neurons engage neighboring neurons, a certain logic comes into existence. Stick with me here, all of this comes into play with innovation. These connections amongst neurons are called synapses. Each neuron, each sprouting dozens of dendrites, can connect to more than 1,000 other neurons. The connections of all these many neurons form neural pathways and networks. And because these pathways extend to every region of the body, the connected collections of neurons can control and operate the body with charged active logic. By the way, I created a YouTube playlist for this Innovate with Ease channel called The Brain. I encourage you to take a look at that and watch all of these videos in order as they're listed in that playlist. And watch this particular video by Zachary Murphy of Ninja Nerd called Neurology, Neuron Anatomy and Function, where Zach explains in details how a neuron works, because this is how you work. I'll link to many other similar videos here as well. Please watch them. Neurons release electrically charged impulses, and they release charged chemicals, neuromodulators or neurotransmitters, from one cell to the next. These impulses are called action potentials. All of this involves chemistry and energy. Where two neurons engage one another at a synapse, these neurons do not actually touch one another, but they do come very close to one another, close enough for these neurotransmitter chemicals to pass back and forth. Based on certain conditions, neurons constantly pass charged chemicals from one to the next, always changing the charge condition of the next. One type of neurotransmitter can reduce the charge of the surface of the next cell, or it can tighten the surface of the cell from accepting chemicals. Other neurotransmitters can increase the charge of the next cell, or it can loosen the surface of the cell to accept more chemicals. Now imagine multiple neurons affecting a connected next neuron with all these varying neurotransmitters. Depending on what loads and ratios of neurotransmitters move from a group of neurons to a connected neuron, an action potential in that neuron can occur. This is a charged shock wave across the cell's surface, moving down its axon to the axon terminal to the next connected neuron. That shock wave is one bit of our overall magic. When billions of connections form, neural networks form, organize, and kick in with action potential pathways. Their vast interconnections form a basis of logic. And when these logic tissues connect with the rest of the body to the muscles and glands and sensory tissues, they can control a body in a logical manner. Connected amongst themselves, they can comprehend, they can control life, they can enable a body to survive its surroundings. Isn't that amazing? Now, in order for these globs of neurons to maintain their structure and work properly, they need to be physically supported in place and structurally held in space. Neural network tissue isn't just a glob of neurons in a soup. There are other cells in there too. Cells called glia cells. Glia means glue. These microglial cells hold all of these thousands, millions, billions of neurons into position, into relation according to each other, and they pass materials to the neurons to feed them energy. Glial cells grow early and allow our neuron cells to ride along during their development and find their positions. Other cells, called astrocytes, which look like little stars, deliver fuel to neurons, remove waste, buffer chemicals, and help to service neurons. Special cells called Schwann cells surround and protect the long axons, prevent neurons from damage, and optimize their action potential shock waves. This culture of cells, with an extremely large and structured set of neural networks, all put into order, result in an organ, a brain. That brain is us. That brain, which holds our mind, engages with the reachable and unknown universe all around it. And it engages that strange universe using its connected body. Our brain sits inside of our head, inside of our hardened skulls, physically protected from that dangerous unknown universe. But it is still connected to everything in the body throughout its extended networks of nerves. And since the brain manages the body, sections of the brain control sections of the body. So sections of the brain are all about real estate. We need to be aware of this since our ability to create, innovate, and react to other creations happens here. Our brains are segmented into specialized regions as different activity takes place in those different areas. Some neural networks are innate to control certain functions like breathing or digesting or heart beating or seeing. But other neural networks are more fluid and plastic and are able to do other magic like store memory or contemplate or plan. But they're all related and they all work together simultaneously. And great innovators need to understand and acknowledge this for many reasons. So let's get into that. Let's look at the brain and its sections, its capabilities and its powers. Let's gain a firm understanding of the very organ that we use to practice the art of understanding. Are you ready for this paradox? Let's go. The first thing to recognize is that our brains were formed very early in the human development cycle. Nearly all animals have brains with the exception of some unusual creatures. And most brains of the animal kingdom look similar, especially in the early stages of development. And early developing brains become very active very early before hatching or before birth. In that early development cycle, human nervous systems produce 4 major functional sections: the spinal cord, the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain, all along one rope of developing neurons. The upper portion, everything except the spinal cord, is known as the encephalon. The forebrain develops into the cerebral cortex, which translates sensory stimulation, controls thoughts, behaviors, memories, and planning. The midbrain will develop into a relay section, sending information from various areas of the body to specific areas of the brain. The hindbrain will control the most basic physiological process such as heart beating or breathing and digestion. The spinal cord will develop with all of the developing body stretching out and connecting nerves that extend throughout. So now, we're all grown up. Let's take a look again. Here we are. The centers of our everything are alive in our heads. If we peek inside, we can see. Hiding behind all of our vessels and muscles, bones and skin, we see us, the core of our nervous system, the brain, the sensory organs, and the spinal cord. That's it. That's basically what we are, this central nervous system. Everything else supports this, and our body moves this around that outside universe. When you encounter another human, this is what you actually encounter, a brain. When we as humans traverse this world and encounter everything in it, this is what's doing that encountering. So let's peek further and see what's here. The top outer portion of the brain, that classic image we're all familiar with, is a wrinkled mass of tissues. It looks like a pile of sausages mashed up into a ball. This is our cerebrum, also called the telecephalon, formed from that early developing forebrain. You can see here that there are 2 hemispheres, a left and a right. This cerebrum is the tissue that innovates, but only some of it innovates. The outer surface of the cerebrum is a somewhat dark color, about 1.5 to 5 millimeters thick. This is what is called the gray matter, like the cap of a mushroom. Underneath that thin skin of gray matter is a lighter colored tissue we call white matter. If we think back to the neuron cell, the soma of the neuron, its body which contains the nucleus and other organelles, These are what make up all that gray matter. The soma bodies of neurons are dark and hence the color gray of the gray matter. All of those little dendrite connections form in this gray matter region as well. Extending down towards the rest of the brain and the body below are the long axons of those cerebral neurons. Axons and the material that covers around them are much lighter in color compared with the darker soma bodies, and so the white matter of the brain is actually all the axons extending down into the brain, like the gills of a mushroom. These are all the wired connections to the gray matter on the outside. So basically, it's the surface of the cerebrum that performs all of the thinking, not the middle. The surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex. The middle mass of the cerebrum, the many fibers of axons, just connects thoughts and action potentials. So to maximize thoughts, we have to maximize the number of neurons. And with a maximum number of neurons, a large surface area is needed to pack them all in, since all of these soma bodies are at the outer reaches. But with a large cortex surface area, like the rubber skin of a balloon, we would need to have a large skull to fit it all inside to protect. But if you think about it, if a skull is too large, it becomes unwieldy to control and prone to possible attack. So to balance a smaller skull with a big balloon inside, we simply crumple the rubber skin of that balloon, and now we can tuck a large surface area into a tighter space, allowing our skulls to be sized appropriate for survival. So the more wrinkles your cerebrum has, and the deeper those wrinkles go, the more surface area it has, and the more neurons you have, and the smarter you become, and the easier it is for you to innovate. But most of us don't use all of those neurons anyway, so just being human, we all have tremendous potential to innovate with ease. But realize this built-in capacity that you have to begin with. Now, these cortex wrinkles of our cerebrum have a certain structure. These structures are similar in all of us. A crest of a particular wrinkle is called a gyrus. Many crests are called gyri. A dip between wrinkles is called a sulcus, and many dips are called sulci. Gyri and sulci exist all across the cerebrum. Certain major sulci exist in particular areas, and certain sections between them are called lobes. And each lobe of the brain can be subdivided into certain sections. These lobes relate to certain innate functions of our bodies. That is, they're formed to work in certain ways since our conception. And it's very beneficial to understand these functions to enlighten your creative potential. In the front, we have the frontal lobe, left and right, separated by the central sulcus from behind, and the lateral sulcus from beneath. The very front section of this frontal lobe is the prefrontal cortex, or the prefrontal association area. This area of the brain is involved in learning, memory, decision-making, judgment, motor planning, executive planning, personality, and behavior. This is where our conscious cursor of the mind mostly exists. So if you do something voluntarily, that cognitive activity takes place here. This is where your most creative and innovative thoughts occur. A small area above the prefrontal cortex is called the frontal eye fields. This is involved with the voluntary movement of our eyes, which are typically the most moved parts of our body. It's very close to our prefrontal cortex because eye movements are generally the first things to be moved voluntarily in response to that weird, dynamic, and potentially threatening universe outside. Very important to note with regard to designing features of creations, since creations need to be noticed. There's also a special area here where your right-handedness and left-handedness exists, as well as speech control. The biggest portion of this lobe is dedicated to our voluntary motor movement. These neural networks are connected directly to the center of your brain and the spine. They control our decisions to use skeletal muscles. If you design creations that involve decisions of movement, those activities take place here, even for the muscles of speech and facial expressions. Need a smile? Someone's frontal cortex needs to be aroused. Just behind this is a crest called the precentral gyrus. Technically, this is considered part of the frontal lobe, but it has shared functions. It's also known as the primary motor cortex and is involved with voluntary movement. It works with sections of the frontal lobe for the planning, sequencing, and execution of movement. Many of these primary cortexes that we'll find across the brain are generally accompanied by adjacent association cortexes. So, in front of the primary motor cortex is an association motor cortex. Association cortexes generally receive signals from a primary cortex, compare those signals with memories similar to those signals, and react based on the differences or similarities of those signals. If signals are very similar to existing memories, and those memories do not relate to danger, if they relate to comfort, the brain may dismiss the experience or enjoy the experience, and the brain can decide reactions accordingly. But if the signals do not compare to existing memories, the brain can focus full attention and evaluate the experience for importance, react in some manner even if the reaction is irrational, and then store the entire experience as a deep memory. It's much more complex than that, but this is the general idea. And again, please visit my YouTube playlist called The Brain and look for the particular video to learn about the basics of the frontal lobe and the primary cortex of that lobe. Behind the central sulcus at the top of our cerebrum is the parietal lobe, and this lobe is mostly about the somatic senses. This area of the brain is closely connected with the sensory nerves that extend throughout the body and, of course, extends to other areas of the brain. These senses are our detection and processing of the physical stimuli such as touch, pain, temperature, vibration, pressure, shock, object weight, things like those. These types of senses are called proprioception, knowing where you and your limbs are positioned and oriented within your own space. We can judge object shape, texture, solidity, fluidity, and mass. These feelings help us to identify objects and features by physical feel. So if you reach in your pocket and you feel your keys, you know that they're your keys just by how they feel and their material and their weight and their texture. Behind the central sulcus is the primary somatosensory cortex. This is involved with our conscious awareness of somatic senses. And of course, behind that is the somatosensory association cortex. And this is involved with the analyzing, recognizing, and memory storage of somatic senses. So if you design creations where an observer has to feel features, feel weight, feel textures, feel warmth or cold, or feel mass, if they have to recognize the identity of the designed object and be able to operate their body to use it, you as a designer or engineer are recruiting this portion of the brain to do that. Feeling features with certain textures can directly arouse specific emotions, so it can be a critical aspect of design. Again, go to that YouTube playlist, The Brain, to learn more about this parietal lobe. There's some surprising things to be aware of about this lobe. Behind the parietal lobe, behind the parieto-occipital sulcus, is the back of our cerebrum we call the occipital lobe. The most posterior gyrus is called the primary visual cortex, which is involved with conscious awareness of visual stimulus. A gyrus above this is called the association visual cortex. Like the others, this association cortex is involved with applying meaning, understanding, and recognition of visual stimuli. Now, it might seem counterintuitive that the visual part of your brain is in the back, but once you study what's behind the eyes and how this develops early, it all makes sense. Once you see a feature or object with your eyes, you can experience conscious awareness of this visual that the primary visual cortex builds. And the neural networks of that cortex will pass information to the nearby visual association cortex and other areas. The visual association cortex will decipher and analyze the image. It will compare the image with past imprinted memories, associate it, and compare. From there, the cortex can determine how different the visual is, or if the visual is new, it may push for prolonged visual scans of an object to establish understanding. Very involved, very complex. This involves motion and texture and color and lighting and depth and comparison around an environment of many other objects. The association cortex is very powerful and complex, especially with its active form understanding, and performing all of this in real time. This occipital lobe is one of the most challenging parts of the brain to study. Again, I encourage you to study the occipital lobe as much as you can to learn about the visual processing. It is so critical in designing effective creations and to form viable innovations, especially to make creations approachable and readable. That is, to include visual aspects where an observer can properly interpret it. If you can form an even basic understanding of visual processing, you can launch quickly for innovating with ease. And so now we move on to the lower portion of the cerebrum called the temporal lobe. This is just below the lateral sulcus and in front of the occipital lobe. It's kind of beside your ears and beside your temples, and this includes the primary auditory complex along with the gyrus just below the lateral sulcus. This is involved in the conscious awareness of auditory stimuli or sound. From your ears, this can pick up various frequencies, volumes, intensities, intonations, shocks, spatial location, everything related to the uniqueness of fluid vibrations that are picked up by our ears. And, like the other primary cortexes, beside the primary auditory cortex is you got it, the association auditory cortex. See how this goes? The brain is smart, isn't it? This association cortex gives us comprehension, understanding, and meaning of sounds. Now, there's this little area, sort of an island all to its own, that's at the intersection of the temporal, occipital, and parietal lobes called the Wernicke's area. And here, where neural pathways cross auditory, visual, and motor control cognitive processing, this area of neural tissues can comprehend and understand written and spoken languages, which of course involves auditory, visual, and motor skills. When your eyes and ears work together to watch someone speak, your brain can understand it quickly and on the fly. And when you respond to them, that language can arise from here. So if you design a creation where language communication is involved, you're recruiting these particular neural networks. If the communication features that you design are easily visible and easily vocalized, the message can be processed easily. If not, then it might be of benefit for you to study this particular area of neuroscience. At the bottom of the temporal lobe, on the inside portion of the cerebrum, we have this little area called the primary olfactory cortex next to its association olfactory cortex. These areas help us become consciously aware of smells. Its associated cortex analyzes aromas and helps us to recognize smell patterns. It even coordinates with our limbic system and affects our emotional responses to smell. And there's another secret cortex deep in the temporal lobe. There's this little lobe called the insular cortex. This little cortex receives information about taste gustation. We can sense a spectrum of taste varying from sweet, sour, salty, bitter, or umami tastes. It also receives signals of visceral information, the sensations of our internal organs. When you get a tummy ache, you feel it. When you get butterflies in your stomach, you feel it. These are examples of visceral senses, and there's a small association cortex involved with that as well. So when you experience food that once made you ill, you may catch that former emotion and resist eating that food. But again, check the video in the brain playlist for more about this temporal lobe, which goes into finer detail about the auditory, olfactory, and insular cortexes and more. So, that's the cerebrum, the big part of the brain. We'll go through the other critical parts of the brain underneath the cerebrum in our next show. But for now, take some time and reflect about the different areas of the cerebrum and think about how they relate to our lives and experiences. And to design with excellence, it is very handy to capture more and more knowledge about this part of our brain. In summary, we have our frontal lobe, our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, and our temporal lobe, all made of neurons. Each of these lobes have primary cortexes that capture thoughts and stimulus. Each primary cortex is paired with an association cortex. So things are captured, processed, associated, reacted, decided, stored, recalled, or searched. Our brain is an amazing organ, and you'll need it to create and innovate. You'll especially need it to predict and plan how others might likely react to the creations that you'll make. So before our next show, check out the links in the show notes and be sure to look at the brain playlist that I provided to you. If you can gain even an elementary level of understanding of these areas of neuroscience, you'll be many steps ahead for creating with excellence and innovating with ease. Yes, engineers, the physics, chemistry, and calculations of engineering are important, but if you study a bit of brain science, you'll see why everything comes together. Try this as an exercise before our next show. Knowing that all the primary cortexes of our cerebrum are interacting with nearby association cortexes, practice associating your thoughts. To create effectively, you'll need access to your deepest thoughts, to every possible memory. So activate and arouse those old lost neural networks. Keep them alive and thriving. That's a great way to exercise your brain. How do we do this? Force yourself to find associations. Let me demonstrate. The floor beneath me is concrete. I associate that with the time that I put up my mailbox using ready mix concrete. I remember the peanut butter-like consistency of that wet concrete mix. I remember the aroma of it. I remember how rough and sandy and wet that concrete felt in my hands. I remember the weight of my boots I was wearing while I was handling the concrete. I remember the taste of salty sweat that dripped from my forehead when I was mixing it in the hot sun. I remember my blue wheelbarrow that I used to mix the concrete. I remember the glisten of water from the garden hose as the sun penetrated the stream of water as I washed out my wheelbarrow. I remember my grandfather's wheelbarrow and how older it was compared to mine. I remember that pride that I felt owning my own wheelbarrow. I remember riding with my grandfather in his Buick to the cement mixing plant as we were planning out a concrete project. I remember the easy listening music that he played on his FM radio in that Buick as we went to that concrete plant. I remember the tempo of this song called Music Box Dancer that played on in the radio. I remember this image of a ballerina in my imagination to that song. From a concrete floor to a ballerina. Doesn't make sense, does it? It doesn't really need to. I just did all of that on the fly, and it was just association after association after association, arousing those old memories, bringing those neurons back to life. See how that works? Try it. Look at anything and practice that chain of associations with anything that it reminds you of. Anything that comes to mind, no guilt. Then jump to the next association, and the next, and the next, and the next. Doing this wakes up those dormant but still present neural networks, waking them up and waking up other networks nearby. This exercise makes you more effective for excellent creation that comes next. Do this frequently and you'll be closer to effective creating. And all those primary cortexes, the motor, the somatosensory, the visual, the auditory, olfactory, insular, they're all connected to things: ears, eyes, tongue, the body. But the primary frontal cortex, that one's all on its own. That one is you, in command of everything. So grab onto your prefrontal cortex and be ready for our next show. Follow on the X social network at Innovate Ease, and follow the Facebook group Innovate with Ease. We'll see you on part 2 of the Motor of Innovation, and we'll explore deeper areas of the brain and the mind. Thank you for listening today.
I do believe we are destined for great things.